Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show. My name is Yoli Chisholm, and I am the CMO here at Auditchain. And in today's episode, we'll be talking to Jason Meyers, the founder and lead architect at Auditchain. And in this episode, we'll be catching up with him on a number of incidents that have happened in this ecosystem and getting his thoughts and helping us to connect the dots. If you are watching us on YouTube, please hit the subscribe button and turn the notifications on so that you can be updated whenever we have an update. And if you're listening to us on a podcast, we thank you for following up, and we will have a weekly episode. So that being said, let's get on with the show. Okay, hey Jason. So I'm glad we are doing this and having this conversation. I wanted to, I always find it interesting the way you think and the way you kind of connect what might look like disparate events and make people think. So I thought we'd open up the conversation to the community. The first off is the recent charges of Ian Balina, who sort of became a well-known person during the ICO days. I wonder if you can just share your thoughts on the charges themselves and why Ian, or any other sort of context for how we should be thinking about this.
Thanks. I am glad we're doing this. It really helps communicate how we think about these things to our community. With regard to the Ian Balina case, these cases are a dime a dozen, right?
Yeah.
The SEC's position was made clear by Joseph Kennedy in 1934. When you're part of the securities industry or you are an issuer of securities, this stuff is part of life, like breathing air, right? And so it's not surprising that another countless number of cases has come to light and has been filed by the SEC. But it's important to know that the SEC is big enough to perform feats of social engineering. So what do I mean by that? Mm-hmm. Well, Bitcoin was the first, or its community was the first to really engage in social engineering, because now everyone knows what a central bank is and what they do. And pretty much everyone knows the debasing effects of a central bank when they print money, right? And I'm not going to go into why they print money, how they print money, what are the checks and balances, and so on and so forth. But it's a feat of social engineering. Nobody knew what the Howey test. I did not know the Howey test existed until the crypto space started talking about the Howey test. Right. And I lived under the SEC's regime for 25 years. Now, why didn't I know about the Howey test? Because I didn't care. It was part of life for me. You just complied with securities laws. That's it, right? So what was particularly interesting in the Ian Balina case was the SEC's raising of the concentration of miners that validated the transaction in a single place, right? They said that the majority of the miners that mined the transaction were located in the United States. Therefore, the transaction took place in the United States, right?
Right.
So, now, that's a jurisdictional argument that has nothing to do with whether or not a thing is a security and that you need to comply with securities laws. That's a different conversation, right? So, but it raised the possibility, the visibility of something that's very obvious to me. One, now that Ethereum has moved from a democratic society where you prove computational work to an imperial society where you prove the stake of value, right?
Mm-hmm.
That imperialized Ethereum. It's not democratic anymore, unless you got 32 ETH and you want to run a validating node. However, something tells me, and I don't know for sure, but the way Ethereum is structured now is the majority of the smaller members of the community that play with $500, $1,000, $2,000, $5,000 are now
They're kind of locked out, right?
the barrier to entry for contributing to the base layer of Ethereum
It's
from
high.
a validation standpoint has now excluded them,
Right.
which creates a higher concentration of a digital society. What has happened has laid the groundwork for a digital impression of what society is now and its wealth gap, right?
Right.
So now, the other part of this is, well, who's going to run all these nodes? Well, right now, Lido, Coinbase, and Kraken are the majority. I think over 60% of the ETH at stake on the Ethereum blockchain, right? They're doing the bulk of the validations. So what happens now is, and I know I'm moving away from Ian Balina, but this is that claim that the SEC made
That they have jurisdiction.
was a real eye-opener, right?
Right.
In the United States, under the SEC's regime, there are what are called gatekeepers, right? What's a gatekeeper? A bank that's registered as a broker-dealer is a gatekeeper. A broker-dealer is a gatekeeper. A custodian is a gatekeeper. Transfer agents are gatekeepers. Asset managers are gatekeepers. Lawyers, accountants, and DTC. Though that is your gatekeeper community. Now, the SEC doesn't enforce the law because they can't stand over you inside of a bank or wherever and make sure that you comply with the law. Each gatekeeper is responsible for the enforcement and the compliance and enforcement of the SEC's body of laws, right? Which is clearly, and I swear to you, it is so friggin' clear. If you know how to read, you'll know how clear it is. The two main pieces of legislation under the SEC's regime is the Securities Act of 1933. That's for an issuer, that's your coming out.
Right.
Initial disclosure, right? I'm coming out. And it governs new issues. The Securities and Exchange Act of 1934 is you're staying out as an issuer, right? Because you've got to provide ongoing disclosure. Plus, there are a lot of rules in the 34 Act that govern the behavior of exchanges that trade securities after they've been issued, right?
Right.
So,
can I just pause you there for a second? Like, to a layman, what I had understood was that in terms of jurisdiction, it was more like the jurisdiction, if the company's head office or if the company's not headquartered in the US, then they are subject to different laws based on where they have been sort of incorporated. But it sounds like if they set precedent with this case, that they can say if the nodes physically are in the US, then the SEC has jurisdiction over them.
That's just one way of asserting jurisdiction by a litigant. The SEC is a litigant,
Yeah.
a plaintiff, like any other plaintiff. They are petitioning a federal court to hear their case against a defendant. So they just happen to have more money to litigate than any defendant, right?
Right.
So unless you're Ripple, who can mint and sell more XRP than the SEC can probably get out of appropriations in a single year, right?
Interesting. Yes.
So that's a very interesting case. I'm not gonna get into it now. But the point of a gatekeeper is it's got compliance and procedures manuals, right?
Yeah.
So if you're a trader at a bank, right, and you break a rule, well, there has to be a record of the bank penalizing you for it. So they keep a file in your personnel file and in your regulatory file, right? When a customer complains against a retail broker, that complaint is logged. And if the firm doesn't demonstrate to the regulator that they have sufficiently penalized the broker or whoever it was, then the SEC is going to not only ding you for breaking the rule, but they're going to ding you for failure to supervise, right?
Gotcha.
If you don't have adequate supervisory procedures written down in a manual handed out to every employee who signs a document says that they've received it and they understand it and agree to comply with it, well, then that's a violation of a number of things. But it is a failure to supervise. Failure to implement adequate supervisory procedures is a separate rule, right?
Right.
Failure to supervise is one thing. Failure to implement adequate supervisory procedures is another thing. So it's a hierarchical and interlocutory enforcement system that the SEC relies upon the gatekeepers to hold it all together. So now, when it comes to Ethereum, right? Look, Ethereum has absolutely revolutionized financial services. It's proven that, right?
Right.
It's proof. What's the proof, right? It's not Ethereum itself. It's Uniswap.
It's the apps that have been built on it.
Yeah, I want to really zero in on this.
Yeah.
It's Uniswap, Aave, Compound, right? Uniswap makes 60,000 markets globally. 60,000 markets. You know how many employees they have? Less than 20. Less than 20. 20 employees.
And
how much does that
how do
cost?
they manage all of that?
Hold on 1 second. Hold on. I want to. There's a contrast that's really important. The chief operating officer or the chief financial officer of JP Morgan, when he contemplates 60,000 markets, which they don't make, right? Looks around the world and sees somewhere between $6 and $10 billion in fixed costs every year to support making markets for the number of markets that they make, which includes personnel, IT, middle, back office, custody, clearance, and settlement and compliance. Right?
Right.
$6 to $10 billion. So now when he turns around and looks at something like this Uniswap thing, the first thing he's got to do is a backflip. That's number one.
Right.
Number two, he immediately marshals people in his office to create a deck. He goes to the CEO's office. He grabs him by the lapel and he says, "We are going to die. You need to look at this and we need to call a board meeting as soon as possible." And they show it to the board of directors, which is populated by people that don't know that much about blockchain, if at all, right?
Right.
So that's a slow-moving monolith, right? Same with Bank of America, Citi, Deutsche, JP, UBS, all of them. Some move faster than others, but these are large monolithic organizations which are on the verge of a long-term architectural upgrade cycle. What does that mean in plain English? They're going to do a lift and shift, because if they don't look at Uniswap for market making and that model, or Aave for lending and borrowing, right? And Compound for governance, right? In a lending and borrowing environment, then they deserve to be shot and dissolved. They deserve to die. But since these are the most powerful institutions in the world, you have to believe that they will eventually become the majority of ETH at stake on the Ethereum blockchain. You have to. If you believe Web3 and blockchain is here to stay, which I do, I'm sure you do too, a lot of people watching also believe that, then and you believe that these are the most powerful institutions of the world, which if you don't believe that, then I don't know what
to tell you.
Right? Then you must hold that they will be the majority of ETH at stake. Now, I know what some of the people watching this are saying. So we're just going to go to another chain. Good. They don't want you here. They don't want
Which is
you
why
here.
they've put the barriers.
Over $1 trillion in digital assets. That is not even a rounding error to the financial services industry. They have hundreds of trillions of dollars, and they want their clients to benefit from this. So if your measly $500, $1,000 is offended by that, and you're going to go to another chain, that's what they want you to do.
Okay, so hang on, Jason, because you said a lot. Let's try and connect the dots for the folks like me who are just trying to understand the space for a second. So we started talking about Ian Balina and his case, and out of that, the key takeaway is this jurisdiction, the notion of jurisdiction. And then you talked about, social engineering, talked about the big change that is happening in the banking space. Part of the Ethereum merge put a higher barrier to entry. Why? And what I'm hearing from you is like, well, if you connect the dots that these big banks want in,
they're in already.
They're okay. In already, and now they basically want to end up being the people that run most of the nodes, right, and make the most money in this shift. Is that kind of what you're saying? Like, what is the implication of the merge?
Okay.
Like you said that Ethereum is no longer decentralized. It is essentially,
there's a layer of it that is susceptible to re-centralization.
Okay.
Right?
Yes.
So, and some Bitcoiners, how you doing, guys? And I agree with you, will say that Ethereum was never decentralized in the first place. The Bitcoiners, the Bitcoin core developers will agree with that. I wish we were live in a way. But anyway, look, gatekeepers have a responsibility. If they don't enforce the law, then they're going to get in trouble from the SEC.
Right.
The SEC has a public image problem right now because, crypto people are very vocal, and you see the tweet storms on Twitter about how they're stepping their bounds and they're unconstitutional and all this stuff. And maybe they are, maybe they're not, but the banks, the incumbent banks, right? And by the way, the SEC and the banks are on the same side. It is not oppositional, right? People need to understand that, right? The banks have an interest in preserving this architecture because that's how they operate, right? So they don't want to get rid of the 33 Act or the 34 Act. In fact, they don't want a new framework that governs only crypto. So when Gary Gensler says there's no reason to treat crypto any differently than the traditional capital markets. Well, the banks believe that too, right? Because they want to be the financial intermediary. They don't want to be disintermediated.
But it seemed like there's two classes of gatekeepers. There's the traditional gatekeepers, and then there's these new gatekeepers who, if the SEC gets what they want, do these new gatekeepers, like the exchanges, do they have
Oh, 1 second. What do you mean by new gatekeeper? There is only one type of gatekeeper under the SEC.
Well, so I'm just trying to think about, like, who has the technology right now to, like, know the SEC rules, embed them in their platforms and apps and protocols, etc., and then track and monitor that they're actually following and not violating those rules, like
large banks. But
they haven't been enabled on the blockchain, have they? Like,
we don't know what they're enabled for or not enabled for. We only know what they say and what news outlets report.
Right.
So if you're smart, you must take the position. Look, case in point, 4 years ago, Jamie Dimon said Bitcoin's a fraud. Yeah. And to a large extent, he still says that stuff.
Yeah. Because maybe they're not ready with their tech yet.
No. JP Morgan built Quorum. Everybody knows that JP Morgan built Quorum. What did they do with Quorum? They traded it. They traded Quorum in exchange for a piece of Consensus. Consensus owns Quorum now. For those that don't know, Consensus is a Brooklyn-based Ethereum studio started by Joe Lubin that has gotten very big. They raised money from Visa and from JP Morgan and others. They control 40% of the Ethereum infrastructure. So, in other words, access to blockchain.
Wow.
Right? Infura belongs to Consensus. But my point is that Bank of America has the largest blockchain patent portfolio, I think behind IBM, or they're ahead of IBM. These banks have been watching very closely what's been going on, and they're tinkering, on the R&D side, and some are preparing for a lift and shift. And maybe it's not a lift and shift, maybe it's a build and integrate, but that's not the point. The point is they are the ones most prepared, and the SEC has the most amount of confidence in its gatekeeper community to maintain a majority of wholesale compliance. What the SEC wants to do is they want to be able to get in front of the Senate Banking Committee and the Financial Services Committee, and they want to be able to say that they're an efficiently run organization for the benefit of the public good, because they protect investors, right? Because they get money out of these agencies, out of these committees every year, right? So back to your Ian Balina case. This is just one of many cases, right?
Right.
First of all, they already probably proved that Ian Balina was located in the United States when he did that, right? That transaction.
Right.
Sparkle.
I forget Spark something.
Yeah, the charges are the same. It's just a different name, right? And the nature of the charges are the same. It's an unlawful distribution of unregistered securities. And a lot of the times it's a 10b5 case, because after they illegally distributed the security, they traded it on an unregistered an unregistered exchange, right? Mm-hmm. And they pumped it and manipulated it. So that's a 10b violation, right? There's 10b1, 10b5, 10, there's subsections. Yeah. But the point is that they violated the anti-fraud provisions of the SEC, right?
So he'll get dinged on that, but do you think that they use this case to lay the groundwork for this notion of jurisdiction?
It's not just jurisdiction. They're laying the groundwork and communicating to the world that we got this. This is our turf and has been since 1934.
Wow.
And we're not creating a new body of law to govern it. Period. End of story.
I think that's
end of story.
You're saying there's no new set of laws. They're going to use existing frameworks.
That's right. You know why? It costs a lot of taxpayer money to create a new framework. Why? Because that bill's got to be floated to the House. It's got to be confirmed by the Senate. By the time it makes it out the other side to get signed by the president, there's about 500,000 pigs and vats of pork stuffed in that thing, which is going to cost American taxpayers more money, right?
Do you think that what's happening just in the financial markets in general is kind of pressing some level of urgency in getting the blockchain industry covered by the SEC this way?
Yes, that's my whole point. It's a quantitative regulatory compliance event, right? So this Ian Balina case, usually they just publish them in the log of the SEC. If it's securities, if it involves securities law violations with securities made out of paper, like traditional securities, and that are book entry at DTC, you wouldn't. It's not a big deal. But the moment they're made out of cryptography, the SEC wants to show the world, not just the people of the United States, the world, that they are going to get this under control, and that the wheels of justice may be slow, but they are steadfast. So if you're thinking you're going to get around securities laws, one, you have two options. One is to find a Ruth Bader Ginsburg type that will take you all the way to the Supreme Court. Not likely, because there are many White and Case, Wilkie Farr, Aiken Gump, Proskow. Every law firm in the world practices before the SEC. They don't want that. They want the 34 Act. They don't want any of that stuff changed. So they're going to submit oppositional briefs in a Supreme Court. It's just not going to happen. There is no RGB that's going to take you all the way up and win, right? And the other option is you need to recruit, build, and train a larger standing army than the U.S. military.
Well,
those are your two options.
That's not happening. So do you think that Ethereum, the organization, kind of went through this whole thought this through, fast forwarded, and we're like, okay, we've got to, or do you think that it's just a coincidence? Like, do you think that
I don't know if people got together around a table and with their dastardly laughs and plotting.
No.
I can't. Who cares, right? It's just, this is what I see. Why do I see it? Because I've lived under that regime for 25 years. And you got people at Coin Center, and I admire, like this one lawyer, Jake Sheverinsky, who I love, right? And if anyone is going to figure out a way to widen the cracks of existing legislature, it's them, and it's him, right? He used to be general counsel for Compound Labs. It's just, if it flickers on a ticker, it's security, man. If you're asking someone to make an investment decision, you've got to comply with securities laws.
Yeah.
Right? Or you need to geofence your token so that it is guaranteed never to end up in a wallet controlled by a U.S. person, and your entity needs to be outside the United States, and you have to conduct all offers and sales outside the United States. But everybody wants access to the U.S. market. They just don't like the securities laws that govern it. right? And when I say it flickers on a ticker, it's a security, unless it's frozen concentrated orange juice, wheat, spot gold, or Bitcoin, right? But I'm not going to declare that Bitcoin's not a security, but proof of work is less susceptible to being entangled in securities law enforcement actions than Ethereum is now, right?
Right.
If I put up a staking infrastructure and I charge money for people to delegate their tokens to that infrastructure, the SEC has a very, very good case that that scheme is an investment contract. They're expecting a return. They're relying on me to give it to them. And there's an exchange of money.
Yeah.
Is Ethereum money? Who's going to make that argument? Come on. Right? Yes, Ethereum is money because it's immediately convertible into the US dollar. Immediately. So it's an exchange of value, right? It really is. Look, if you got more money, then fight the SEC, right? Who has more money?
So most companies, most organizations that are building in the blockchain space don't have and are not interested in fighting the SEC, and some don't have the capacity, like maybe a Ripple, but also want to focus on their build. So what does this mean for companies that are either building in the blockchain space, have already conducted ICOs, or that's how they funded their projects? What do you think they can do to sort of preempt or anticipate having to comply with the SEC?
Well, one, they should have complied with the SEC. So if you didn't, I don't know what to tell you, right? I mean, you can try to, I don't know, you can capitulate and try and comply now, but you should have thought about this a long time ago when you did. Now, look, even I was convinced 5 years ago, 4 years ago, that this thing maybe they're not securities, right?
Right.
But I was never one that prior to 5, 6 years, when I got into crypto, I knew the securities laws, and I took for granted that they really couldn't or shouldn't be challenged because it was just such a part of life, right? My point is that 80% of securities law compliance for an issuer is financial disclosure.
Yeah. And so maybe this is a good transition to, what we're building with Auditchain. For those gatekeepers, you kind of ran through a list of the sort of types of organizations that you consider gatekeepers. How can they use technology like Auditchain? Like maybe just give a couple of examples.
Look, everybody has an accounting system. And if you don't have an accounting system and you issued a token in exchange for whatever value, cash, Ethereum, Bitcoin, whatever, you're in a lot of trouble because, first of all, the sale of a token is not paid in capital like equity in a company is. When you sell shares of a company, it's paid in capital. It's not a taxable event. When you sell tokens, that's prepaid revenue. There's a tax implication, right?
Right.
So, and I'm sure most projects have accounting systems and have kept records, but I will say that I know very large projects that are still reconstructing the past, right? And I'm not going to mention any names.
But we also see traditional organizations. I mean, there was just that article this week about the SEC charging 16 Wall Street firms with widespread record-keeping failure.
Yeah, but that's not accounting records. That's email and communications retention requirements. That's different. What I'm talking about is being able to articulate financial state at a bare minimum of periodically, whatever is required by law. In the United States, it's every quarter, right? And you go through a review by an external auditor, and then you go through a full-blown audit at the end of the year, right? So most projects they don't even know what financial reporting is, right?
Yeah.
And to be honest with you, I've learned more about financial reporting in the last 5 years than I think I've known in the previous 25 living under the SEC's regime, right?
Right.
It's a highly technical process. It's not exporting a balance sheet out of an accounting system that's made out of a PDF or a piece of paper. It's not, right? So, and in our work involves allowing crypto companies, assuming the contents of their accounting system is kept up to date and is correct, to be able to articulate this and be to whoever, doesn't have to be public, but at a bare minimum, to be one click away from filing in any of the 51 jurisdictions that mandate the use of this XML-based syntax called XBRL, which has got added logic, which is useful for accounting and financial reporting, logic and data, right?
Yeah.
So when you go to sec.gov and you read a 10K or a 10Q, you might see HTML, but that's a 5 megabit instance document that contains multi-dimensional knowledge graphs and a multitude of subgraphs, right? And so that's semantic knowledge, right? So it's complicated stuff. It's not just accounting rules, but it's technology. And anyway, as you know, that's what we do. So,
yeah. And how soon?
What I am curious
yeah.
is if you assume for a moment the worst, and listen, I hope I'm wrong. I want someone to prove me wrong because I'm heartbroken about this merge. But assuming the worst, and the majority of Ethereum is controlled by the gatekeepers, the question then becomes how you validate at the base layer without friction and without assurance that the transactions that you're validating, forget about Ethereum itself, the Ether token.
Yeah.
I'm talking all the tokens on top of it. How do you validate with assurance that those tokens are in compliance with securities laws? Because you could be validating transactions that aren't in compliance with securities laws, which at the base layer level, if you had to count them, that's tens of thousands, hundreds of millions of counts of securities law violations. Millions.
But isn't it going to be the platforms through which the transaction happens that would have to be doing the sort of checking to make sure that the transaction?
No, the validators have to check that. If I'm a bank and I'm validating transactions and I'm registered with the SEC and I got a compliance procedures manual and I'm a gatekeeper, I can't be involved in any transactions that are not compliant with the SEC's laws. So how do I prove? I need proof at the validation level, at the base layer, Otherwise, we're going back to the Stone Age in terms of Ethereum network congestion will grind to a halt if there isn't proof of financial disclosure, securities law compliance by the token issuers whose token transactions I, as a validator, am validating at the base layer. Plus, when you deploy a smart contract, I got to validate that too. How do I know you provided proof of financial disclosure? How do I know that?
Well, I mean, isn't that why these KYC platforms and
that has nothing to do with securities law compliance? No, that's KYC. That's FinCEN, right? It's enough to make your head spin. But if you've lived under this regime, it is part of life. It's second nature. It's just a question of cost and expense.
And the
right?
folks that can afford it are the big banks.
That's correct.
Well, I think that's a good place to maybe end and have folks think. I'd be curious. For folks that are listening to this on YouTube, definitely, comment your thoughts on what Jason has shared. Let us know what you think. Well, Jason, thank you for a very illuminating and enlightening conversation. I'm definitely curious to hear what the community thinks. And hopefully we can continue to do more of these.
Thanks for having me.
Great. All right. Until next time.